You have heard the story before, maybe without knowing where it came from. A crew of laborers is digging into an earthen mound outside a small Illinois town. It is 1922. Something comes up out of the ground that should not be there. Within days, the site goes quiet. The workers are told to keep their mouths shut. The record, if there ever was one, disappears. That is the version that circulates online. It shows up in forum posts and video comment sections, always slightly different, never sourced. Somebody found something under Cahokia in 1922, and somebody made sure nobody talked about it. You are going to spend the next 25 minutes finding out where that story actually comes from, and it is not where you think. Because there really was a dig at Cahokia in 1922. There really was a man running it who clashed hard with the people around him, and there really is a reason the story of what happened that year got twisted into something it never was. The records do not lie. But sometimes you have to go looking for them before you can tell the difference between a cover-up and a filing cabinet. Picture the ground first, before you picture the men digging into it. Cahokia sits on the floodplain across the Mississippi River from what is now St. Louis, Missouri. At its height, somewhere between the years 1050 and 1150, estimates place its population between 10,000 and 20,000 people within the core settlement alone. Some researchers, counting the surrounding satellite communities now buried under East St. Louis and St. Louis itself, push the figure for Greater Cahokia as high as 40,000 or 50,000. Either number was larger than London at the time. The original complex sprawled across roughly 4,000 acres, with something like 120 mounds rising out of the floodplain, built basket load by thousands of hands over generations. Monk's Mound, the largest of them, rises about 100 feet in 4 terraces and still covers more ground at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. West of Monk's Mound, archaeologists later uncovered the remains of 5 separate circles of massive red cedar posts, each one built around a central viewing post. These are known today as wood henges, and certain posts within each circle line up with the rising sun at the solstices and equinoxes when viewed from the center point. Whoever built them was tracking the sky with enough precision to plan an entire city's ceremonial calendar around it, centuries before anyone in Europe would have called this land America. By the time the 20th century arrived, most Americans living nearby had no idea what they were looking at. Farmers plowed around the mounds. Some mounds were leveled outright for road fill and construction. 19th century observers had argued for decades over whether the mounds were even man-made at all, with some insisting they had to be natural hills, because the idea that indigenous peoples had engineered a city of this scale did not fit the story white settlers wanted to tell about the land they had taken, and by then the city itself had been empty for half a millennium. Cahokia's population had already begun declining by around 1200, and the site was fully abandoned by the mid-1300s. To this day, nobody has found solid evidence of the epidemic, invasion, or single catastrophe you might expect to explain a collapse that size. The leading theories point instead to a slower unraveling, overworked farmland, a shifting Mississippi River, and the strain of feeding tens of thousands of people from a maize-based economy that eventually could not keep up with its own city. That argument over whether the mounds were even built by human hands was not settled by guesswork. It was settled by a man named Warren King Moorehead, and 1922 sits right in the middle of the years he spent proving it. You need to understand who Moorehead was before you can understand what actually happened at Cahokia, because almost every version of the rumor skips him entirely and just says workers, as if the dig had no one steering it. Moorehead was born in 1866 and by his 20s was already working under Frederick Ward Putnam, one of the founding figures of American archaeology. In 1893, Putnam sent him to excavate Fort Ancient in Ohio and to gather artifacts for the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. Moorehead later became curator, then director of the archaeology department at Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts, the institution now known as the Robert S. Peabody Institute of Archaeology. Colleagues eventually called him the Dean of American Archaeology, and by the end of his career he had personally excavated more ancient earthworks than anyone before or after him. He was not a quiet academic working in isolation. As a young man in his early 20s, he traveled to Pine Ridge to report on the aftermath of Wounded Knee for a magazine called Illustrated American, work that put him in direct contact with the human cost of federal Indian policy years before he ever picked up a trowel professionally. He went on to excavate Fort Ancient in Ohio in 1893 at the direction of Frederick Ward Putnam, and later fought to have that site preserved as a public archaeological park rather than sold off or plowed under, a fight he won. He served on the United States Board of Indian Commissioners for more than 2 decades. By the time he arrived at Cahokia, he had already spent close to 30 years building a reputation as someone who did not back down from landowners, local officials, or institutions that stood in the way of preservation. That matters, because it is the real source of the friction later generations mistook for secrecy. In September and October of 1921, Moorehead led a preliminary survey of Cahokia. He came back to the site in the spring of 1922 to continue the work in earnest. In April of that year, Lieutenants Goddard and Ramey flew over the site and took some of the earliest aerial photographs ever made of the mounds, giving Moorehead's team a view of the earthworks that no one on the ground could have had. His findings from that survey were published the same year as a University of Illinois Bulletin titled The Cahokia Mounds, a preliminary paper. That is not the language of something suppressed. That is the language of something printed, bound and shelved in a university library where it has sat ever since. So what did the crews actually pull out of the ground that year? In Mound 24, Moorehead's team found an extended human skeleton at a depth of about 4 feet, with flint chips, 2 or 3 flint knives, and pottery sherds near the head. He described digging a trench roughly 60 feet long and 20 feet wide through the mound, turning up broken pottery fragments the whole way through. None of this was hidden. It appears in his own written reports, later collected and reissued with an introduction by archaeologist John Kelly, who has spent much of his career working at Cahokia himself. The aerial photographs taken that April show something else worth noting. They do not show excavation activity at Mound 24 the way you might expect from the ground reports. Instead, they show large excavated areas at a different mound, likely Mound 26, and a possible disturbance line along the edge of Mound 25. This is the ordinary, sometimes contradictory texture of real fieldwork. Ground crews and aerial surveys do not always line up neatly, and reconciling them is part of what archaeologists like Kelly have done in the decades since. Moorehead's crews worked the way most excavators did in that era, before modern stratigraphic recording became standard practice. They dug in trenches and sections, logging depth, soil changes, and artifact position by hand in field notebooks as they went, rather than using the finer-grained digital mapping tools archaeologists rely on today. That was not secrecy, it was simply the technology of 1922. John Kelly's later introduction to Moorehead's reports is explicit that Moorehead combined 19th-century excavation techniques with whatever contemporary analytical methods were available to him at the time, which is exactly what you would expect from a transitional figure working at the edge of his field's development. Later archaeologists did not have to break any seals to check his work. They had to do something much less cinematic. Go back to the same mounds with better instruments and compare notes. There is also a smaller find that has done more to fuel the rumor mill than almost anything else connected to this period. A thin copper serpent effigy, about 4 or 5 inches long, was recovered near Mound 59, which Moorehead's own notes originally dated to the summer of 1922. Later research corrected that date. The serpent was actually found years earlier, in the autumn of 1915, by 3 boys exploring the mounds on a Sunday outing, not by a paid excavation crew at all. One of those boys later gave a detailed account of the exact day, the friends who came with him, and the electric interurban line they rode out from Belleville to get there. Notice what just happened. A small, privately found object got attached to the wrong year in one written record, and that single clerical slip is very likely one of the seeds that grew into the modern legend of something mysterious surfacing in 1922, not a conspiracy. a date that was off by 7 years, corrected by later archaeologists doing exactly the kind of cross-checking this channel exists to show you. Now for the part of the story people actually mean when they say the site was sealed. Kelly's introduction to Moorehead's collected reports notes plainly that Moorehead contended with local social and political pressures throughout his time at Cahokia. That sentence is doing a lot of quiet work, and it is worth sitting with. Cahokia in the 1920s was not protected land. Landowners farmed it, developers eyed it, and local authorities were not universally enthusiastic about a federally connected archaeologist from Massachusetts telling them their cornfields sat on top of a lost indigenous metropolis. Moorehead spent years afterward campaigning, sometimes loudly, for the state of Illinois to preserve the mounds before they were bulldozed for good. He won that fight eventually, but not because everyone welcomed him. That is friction. That is politics. That is not the same thing as a discovery being sealed. But it is easy to see how a story about an archaeologist butting heads with landowners and local officials, told and retold at a distance of a century, could calcify into a story about a mysterious find being shut down and hushed up. The record shows a man fighting to keep the site from being destroyed by indifference. The rumor turns that into a man being silenced by authority. Those are almost opposite stories, and only one of them survives in the documents. Compare this to another Cahokia mystery entirely because it helps to sharpen the difference between real archaeological drama and manufactured drama. Between 1967 and 1971, archaeologists excavated what is now called Mound 72, a smaller ridge-top mound at the site, and found that it was not one mound at all but 3, built up around the year 1000. Inside they found the remains of well over 200 people, and by some counts closer to 300, many of them young women. A number of the burials showed signs of what researchers interpret as ritual sacrifice, including individuals whose heads and hands had been removed. One burial stood apart from the rest entirely. A man laid out on a platform made of more than 20,000 shell beads arranged in the shape of a falcon or birdman figure, a symbol that shows up across Mississippian culture, and that some researchers connect to later indigenous stories of the Piasa, a bird monster still painted on a bluff along the Great River Road not far from the site today. That discovery is decades removed from 1922, thoroughly documented in peer-reviewed literature, and still debated by scholars today over exactly what it meant to the people who built it, whether it reflects warfare, tribute, or a ritual tied to political power. It is a real, sourced, still open question. It has nothing to do with 1922, but you can watch in real time online how these two very different stories get blended together into a single vague memory of something creepy found under Cahokia, with the dates and details sanded off until nothing checks out anymore. That blending is how legends like this one get built. Not from a single lie, but from several true, unconnected things getting pressed together until the seams disappear. Here is what you actually have, laid out in order, with nothing smoothed over. You have a real archaeologist, Warren Moorehead, already respected and already controversial, arriving at Cahokia in the fall of 1921 to run a preliminary survey. You have him back on site through the spring of 1922, digging trenches through mounds, recovering skeletal remains, pottery, and flint tools, and having his work documented from the air by military aerial photographers. You have that year's findings published openly as a university bulletin, the kind of document that sits in library stacks rather than locked vaults. You have decades of follow-up scholarship, including a full reissue of Moorehead's reports with a scholarly introduction, correcting small errors like the misdated copper serpent along the way. And you have ongoing local resistance to preservation, resistance that Moorehead spent years fighting rather than participating in. Nowhere in that sequence is there a moment where digging stopped abruptly, a crew was sworn to secrecy, or a find vanished from the record. What you have instead is the normal, sometimes messy footprint of early 20th century fieldwork, contradictions between ground reports and aerial photos, a date recorded wrong and fixed later, and a scientist at odds with the community around him for reasons that have nothing to do with what came out of the dirt. That does not make 1922 a boring year at Cahokia. It makes it a genuinely important one, maybe more important than the rumor gives it credit for. This is the year the preliminary case for Cahokia as a real engineered indigenous-built city started reaching print in a form other scholars could check, cite, and build on. The mounds survived largely because Moorehead made noise about them when almost no one else was willing to. Consider what the alternative history actually would have looked like if the pessimists around him had won. Cahokia sits close to two growing cities, its mounds made of exactly the kind of loose, workable soil that road crews and construction outfits wanted in the 1920s. Other mound sites across the Midwest were leveled in that decade for precisely that reason. Their soil hauled away one truckload at a time until there was nothing left to excavate at all. Every year Moorehead spent arguing with local landowners and government bodies was a year those same mounds were not being quietly erased. The fight he picked was not incidental to the science, it was the reason there was still a site left to publish a bulletin about. If you are looking for the real story that got buried in 1922, it was never a find in the ground, it was the fight to keep the ground itself from disappearing under a farmer's plow or a developer's foundation. That fight is documented in exhaustive, unglamorous detail, and it did not need a cover-up to be dramatic. Moorehead's campaigning did not save Cahokia overnight, but it started a chain of events that eventually did. The state of Illinois began acquiring parcels of the site through the following decades, slowly assembling what had once been scattered farmland into a protected historic site. In 1982, Cahokia Mounds was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site, placing it in the same category of global significance as the pyramids at Giza and Stonehenge. Today, the protected site covers roughly 5 to 6 square miles and includes 51 surviving platform, ridgetop, and conical mounds, along with a reconstructed section of the wooden palisade wall that once encircled the city's core. The work did not stop with Moorehead, and it has not stopped since. As recently as June of 2024, researchers from St. Louis University, working with the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, flew drone-based LiDAR surveys over acres of thick forest and swampy ground near the main complex, hunting for mound features that might still be hidden under tree cover. Ground excavations that followed turned up ceramics, microdrills, walls, and trenches dating back roughly 900 years. A full century after Moorehead's crews were in the ground with shovels and trowels, archaeologists are still out there finding new pieces of the same city, using tools he never could have imagined and publishing what they find the same way he did, openly in journals and reports anyone can go read. That is worth sitting with for a second. The actual history of Cahokia research is not one dramatic reveal in 1922 followed by silence. It is 100 years of accumulating, correctable, publicly available work, with each generation of researchers checking the last one's math. Moorehead's preliminary paper was one early link in that chain, not a door that slammed shut behind him. You should ask yourself why the fabricated version feels more satisfying than the real one, because that question tells you something about how these stories spread. A story about a secret discovery gives you a villain. Somebody decided you were not allowed to know. A story about bureaucratic friction, land disputes, and a slightly wrong date in a field notebook gives you nothing to be angry at. It just gives you the slow, patient work of people checking each other's math across 100 years. There is also a simpler mechanical reason these stories spread so easily. A claim like "workers found something and were sworn to silence" cannot really be checked by most people watching a video about it. There is no library card catalog entry for a rumor, but a claim like a University of Illinois Bulletin was published in 1922 documenting this exact excavation can be checked, and that is precisely why the vague version survives online while the specific, sourced version stays buried in academic library stacks. Vague claims are durable because they resist verification, Specific claims are fragile in the best possible way. They can be tested, and when they hold up, you actually know something instead of just feeling something. That second story is less exciting, and it is also the true one, and there is no contradiction in holding both of those thoughts at once. The mounds at Cahokia do not need an invented sealed chamber to matter. They were built by tens of thousands of people using nothing but woven baskets and human effort over generations into the largest pre-Columbian city north of the Rio Grande. That fact alone should be enough to hold your attention without anyone needing to make up what happened to it in 1922. The records do not lie. People do, sometimes without even meaning to, when a rumor is more fun to repeat than a citation. You do not need an archaeology degree to have caught most of this yourself, and it is worth walking through how, because the same 4 questions work on almost any "they found something and hid it" story you will run into. First, ask who was actually there. Not workers, not researchers, but a specific named person or team you can look up. This story has a name attached to it, Warren Moorehead, and that alone makes it checkable in a way unnamed crew never is. Second, ask where the findings were published. A real excavation from a real institution almost always produces a report, a bulletin, a museum accession record, something with a paper trail. Moorehead's went into a University of Illinois Bulletin the same year the fieldwork happened. That is the opposite of suppression. Third, ask whether the cover-up detail is actually just friction. Disputes with landowners, funding fights, disagreements between institutions, and slow bureaucracy get misremembered as secrecy surprisingly often because both look the same from far enough away, an outsider being kept from getting what they want. Only one of them involves someone actively hiding evidence. Fourth, ask whether 2 unrelated true stories have been fused together. This is the one people miss most often. Cahokia genuinely has a documented mass burial with real, still debated open questions attached to it. It is just at Mound 72, and it is from 1967 to 1971, not 1922. Once you separate the threads, the mystery mostly evaporates into 2 ordinary, well-sourced archaeological projects that happen to share a location. Run any viral history claim through those 4 questions, and you will filter out most of the manufactured mysteries in this genre before you have even finished your coffee. So the next time you see this story pop up in a comment section, framed as something the world was never supposed to know, you will have somewhere to point. Point to the preliminary bulletin published in 1922. Point to Kelly's later reissue of the reports, with the copper serpent's date corrected in plain sight. Point to a man who spent years fighting local landowners not to hide a discovery, but to keep the mounds themselves from being erased. Point, if you need to the drone survey that flew over the same ground a full century later, still turning up new fragments of the same buried city. That is the record. It was never sealed, it was just waiting for someone to actually go and read it. None of that makes Cahokia smaller or less strange. If anything, it makes it stranger, because you do not need an invented sealed chamber when the true version already includes a city of tens of thousands of people, built by hand, tracking solstices with rings of cedar posts, abandoned for reasons nobody has fully explained 600 years before anyone thought to ask. The manufactured mystery is a distraction from a real one that never got solved either. It just got solved honestly, in public, by people willing to correct themselves when the evidence demanded it. That is the difference between a legend and a record. A legend gets more dramatic every time it is repeated. A record stays exactly the same, waiting in a library or an archive for you to go check it, whether that takes a year or a century.